Great. Well, lovely to be here. My name is Russell. I'm a sea kayak coach for Moderate Water, and I'm one of the cohort that's incoming as a provider for the sea kayak leader qualification. And Matt, who has been mentoring me on that journey, he has kindly asked me to step in. But these are big boots for me to fill. So your patience and your kindness is appreciated this evening. I'm really keen to learn from yourselves in this process of delivering, information, sharing information with you, and then also, your own insights about tides. So I think maybe if we just start off with doing a couple of things. I think Matt is going to put up a wee poll so we can kind of understand a wee bit more about your experience. Would that be okay? And if we just give you a wee minute or two, maybe Matt, you can keep us right on the timings. It'd be brilliant if everyone can fill that in, can respond. Okay, does anyone need a bit of time? Brilliant.
Is that appearing?
Okay, I think there's 2 still to go.
That might just be being you.
Yeah, okay, great, super. So that's great. So what we're seeing is that most of you lead groups already, and you do your own tidal planning. So what we'll try and do is make this as interactive as possible. I've got some slides to take you through, but feed in with your own thoughts. We can make this very much about knowledge sharing. So that's 59% of you, 10 of you. Then we've got 18% next down. So just 3 saying that you paddle with others and are learning more about tidal planning. But it's good to see that we've got 4 people who are really just starting. So that's, shall we say, from those, fairly even, maybe 10 who are leading, feeling quite confident to some degree, and 7 of you who are developing. Okay. I think what I would say is, I think it's a lifelong journey, isn't it? Understanding the sea and understanding how it works. And I don't think any of us ever become experts. I think for me, that's the real attraction of this as an activity, as a sport, as a pursuit. It's that opportunity for continual learning. I'm going to start to share some slides, and I'm going to take you through things. But feel free to reach out on the chat if you have any questions or thoughts, or you can raise a hand. Does anyone not know how to raise a hand? And we can demonstrate that. Use the reactions buttons down the bottom to raise a hand if you want to jump in, or if we're flying on and we're not giving you time and your point's vital, then just unmute and jump in. But we'll try and create a little bit of discussion points as we move through things. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. It always gets, for those of you who are used to Zoom, it can be a slightly strange experience from my end. So let me know if anything, shout out if anything isn't showing. Okay, so you should be seeing that full screen, tides and tidal predictions. Get a thumbs up from someone. Great, thank you. Awesome. Okay, so if you've got, we'll follow up with emails after this, but if you have any questions or suggestions or pointers yourself, then you can email me here. I'll have the email at the end, and we're going to send around a reading list tomorrow or the next day. I'm going to reference a few books and resources that I found super useful. Okay, what are the aims? So I'm just going to say that tonight's not a coastal navigation and tidal planning course. I'm and a lot of you are pretty experienced already. So I'm going to go through kind of 4 kind of groupings of things. I'm going to start off by talking about the inspiration I found in my learning journey about tides, and hopefully you'll find that a source of inspiration too. I'm keen to hear your own ideas as well. We're then going to look at the rules, and my thoughts are, rules is the wrong way to look at something as dynamic as tides. So maybe models, a better way to look at it. We'll dive into some resources, which you may find useful. Interested to know if you've used different ones, and we'll have a look at a couple of case examples, and then we'll kind of tie it off with this, idea of kind of stimulating your spidey senses. So it's the dynamic environment of tide rewards intuition and human sense at least as much as it does planning. Okay, so inspiring the journey, what are tides? Does anyone want to kind of, give us their idea of what tides are just now? I'd love to hear an answer from someone. Just jump into, open your mic and speak if you want.
The movement of water.
Great, brilliant. Any others, additions?
The speed of that movement.
Great.
Movement of water caused by the moon proximity to Earth.
Okay. Yep, good. Well, let's have a look at this year, here we have, we've got Earth, and then you can see here that actually the amount of water on its surface is really, really small, in comparison to that. But what a different, our whole life, is completely dependent upon it. And then within that, you've got this really small amount of fresh water. So this is the thing that we are floating about on, and this is the thing that we are made of. This here's a map of or chart of the ocean currents, from NOAA. Many of you will know this. So you can see here we've got these huge, big movements that are happening globally. And I find it really, really useful to remember that, the tide is happening on this scale. It's, it has been described as a wave, and it's a wave that, well, does anyone know the wavelength of it? You can probably guess. So the wavelength of it is effectively half the circumference of the Earth, and it's you're completely correct that it's affected by the sun, and it's affected by the moon as well. And we've got I'm just realizing I didn't put in my sun and moon slide, so I'm going to talk through that one. But yeah, so we've does everyone know that we have, when the sun and the moon are in alignment, what does that give us?
Spring tides.
Great. And then the neap tides?
Yeah, when they're on opposite sides.
Yeah, so if we're at a kind of right angle, so if we get into this kind of right angle where, maybe off to this side, we've got imagine my head. You've got the kind of, if off to one side, you've got the moon, and then if at right angles, you've got the sun, then that's going to give us a neap. And the cycle for that is, it's continual. We're getting every 2 weeks, we will have approximately a spring tide. So it's week to week, neap, spring. But it's not consistent, what we get. And does anyone know why it changes? Are all springs equal?
With the lunar cycle, 28 days.
Yep. And also, what about our relationship with the sun?
Yeah, we're on an elliptical orbit.
Great, yeah. So what we've got is the sun is something that we are going round, both us, the Earth, and the Moon. And the moon's in cycle with us, but it's slightly out of sync. But so that's why we have this. It's not a lunar. Our lunar cycle isn't the exact same as our own, but it's close enough. And the whole thing's moving kind of in a slightly it's in this elliptical manner. But what we get is that at certain times of the year, like particularly now, for instance, January, typically, the Earth is much closer to the sun, and you get super springs. So sometimes they're called king tides in America. You might have heard that term in the news. And we in our north, we sometimes experience, springs at other times, very big springs at other times of the year. Does anyone notice particularly when that happens?
Around the equinox.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll have a look at a set, going on about how quick ways to kind of find that kind of information. But it's I suppose it's the idea that it's not all tides are equal. They vary. So the water distribution on Earth, they call it the oceanic abyss, the kind of open ocean area, the average kind of depth of that is 4,000 plus meters. So really, really significant depth. And then continental shelves, they're saying about 200 meters here, around the UK, probably 200, 300 meters, kind of on average. And then you come into the kind of closer coastal areas, but also we have basins like the North Sea. Does anyone know the average depth of the North Sea? So it's really shallow. It's actually only about 90 meters in the North Sea. So it kind of puts it into perspective. You've got 4,500 meters out there, continental shelf 200 to 300. So you'll get that off the west coast or up north. When you come into the North Sea, the average is as little as 90 meters. There's some significant variations just off the coast of Norway, but what we have is, I think this here kind of, if you look, what I've taken here actually is a screenshot of Windy. They've got a nice little kind of overlay which gives you a dynamic animation of tides. But if we use it just as a way to kind of look at look at depths and then also kind of look at behaviours. I think the thing, we'll come to the West Coast in a bit, but I wanted if we just dwell for a wee second on the East Coast, like I think it's quite kind of interesting. How does the tide get into, the East Coast of Scotland? How does it get into, the North Sea? Any answers or good answers?
Kind of when it hits Cornwall, it kind of squishes up and round the top and the bottom.
Yeah, great. So brilliant. So it's coming up from the southwest, and then it goes round the top, goes through the Pentland Firth, it gets squeezed there, and that's why we have these incredible, tide races up there, and then it also gets squeezed through the Channel. So I'm based at, I live in Edinburgh, and the paddling around here, there can be a perception that on the East Coast that the tide comes in, goes out, it's straightforward bell curve, but it's not really. Does anyone know where the tides from these 2 points generally meet?
Around about the Humber, just south.
Yeah, brilliant. And how has anyone got? How would you describe the water coming into and moving around and circulating in the North Sea basin? Any thoughts?
Squeeze through any islands such as the Fawn Islands, which is my home area.
Great.
It's squeezed up at the Pentland, really squeezed through there in all the Scottish Highlands. And west coast of Ireland, and even through the Irish Channel, the Minch and everything.
Brilliant. So I think like the way maybe if I just kind of describe the way I've kind of I suppose my perspective, has shifted over the years, and it continues to shift, So when I was like a kid, it was, in fact, probably until not that long ago, probably until I really get into my sea activities, I just saw this, the tide came in and it went back out, like it came from the horizon and it went to the horizon. And, and now I kind of understand that, it comes in around these specific points to the north and to the south. But now I suppose I see it now as not just coming in as just in the direction of, just these arrows. I see these arrows as an indicator for a wave. And this is a wave that is slopping its way around this basin. So if I'm if I'm washing the dishes and I've got the plastic basin and I swirl the water and it laps up and moves round in a wave around the different four corners of the basin, I think that's a kind of metaphor for how I understand now how it moves into and around the North Sea. And of course, it does it inconsistently. It's affected by the size of that tide. It's affected also by weather. Does anyone want to kind of throw in thoughts about how the weather might affect it? So if we've got you obviously got big northerly winds driving down, you can't that's going to push. The push down towards the Humber is going to be greater, and that can affect not only the volume but also the timing. And one of the things I find really fascinating is that if you go into say like into the Forth, then you can have like a bell jar tide, but when the water starts to go out, once it starts to ebb from the Forth, what does everyone think? Does that mean that it's starting to, what direction is it likely to be going along the coast, outside of the estuary?
Heading east.
Northeast.
Northeast, yeah.
Yes, that's really, isn't it? So that's the thing that's really fascinating is you'd expect it to be going northeast, but it's actually still the direction of that wave going down to the Humber it's still to get down to high tide down at the Humber. So even though you're getting ebbing tide in the Forth, you're still getting flooding tide further south. So you're going to have this behaviour where directly on the coast, your water level might be dropping, but it's still heading south as it follows this wave from, this kind of metaphor of, that flopping round the basin. It's a wave that's moving round the basin to get back up to and out of the Pentland Firth area. And so, it's a thing that can catch you out, and you'll know this. Was it Rachel who was saying, at the Farns, you'll see that, you've got quite a different behaviour there from what you might be expecting, and that's going to be further exacerbated by the funneling action of those islands and what we call, well, the technical term is bathymetry, but really, the seafloor, the shape of the seafloor, that really affects things too. Okay.
Seen that quite a lot at the Garvelix.
Great. Yeah. So the West Coast is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? So yeah. Well, we'll come to some. We'll have a wee look there in a second. I suppose it just what I wanted to get across was just this idea that, you know, it's even in something that we think of as a relatively straightforward and perhaps even boring coast like the East Coast, you know, it's relatively linear, doesn't have to the eye, you know, the complexity of the Garvilax or, you know, the kind of myriad of West Coast islands. And yet its behaviour runs counter to what we would expect. We would expect ebb to just go straight out to the north, you know, northeast and out. But it doesn't. It's still that wave is still the tidal wave is still propagating in the basin round. So the water level's dropping, but it's going in the counterintuitive direction for, you know, 2-3 hours, maybe longer if there is significant winds pushing that way, you know, impeding its return. So let's have a wee look at you know, rules or models, and from this discussion that we've just had about, you know, the behaviour, say just an example of the North Sea, I think we're maybe starting to get this kind of idea that, you know, not if we're very rules based, we might come unstuck relatively, you know, from time to time anyway, you know. So we have to kind of be quite. I think it's good to be healthily sceptical, and be having a look at the models. So, you know, you're for the majority of you who, you know, who are already leading, you'll know all this, but for you know, there's just under half of you who are maybe still starting out or still growing. You know, this year, does anyone who is maybe a bit more experienced want to kind of talk someone through this diagram? Who would like to, a new voice, someone who hasn't spoken before? Okay, well, in the absence of anyone else jumping in, I'll just keep going. But it'd be nice to hear from yourselves, because
Russell, I'll talk through it if you want, mate. Save you.
please,
hanging out.
brilliant.
So,
Yeah.
So the height of the tide is directly affected by the moon and the sun. So we don't get the same height of tide every single day. It changes as the moon and the sun change their position to each other, as the moon orbits the Earth and we orbit the sun. So as they become more aligned, then essentially it pulls the tide either higher up the beach or further down the beach, if we use this as an example. And as the sun and the moon become less aligned, for want of a better expression, that pull reduces. So ergo, the water, the sea, doesn't get pulled as far up the beach and doesn't get pulled as far down the beach. So on the diagram here, we have a neap range and we have a spring range. The spring is when the moon and the sun are aligned in relative terms, and the neap range is when the sun and the moon aren't aligned, as Russell mentioned earlier on. So the effects on the water, or the sea, if you like, is greater and lesser, and that's why we have a spring and a neap. But we have a range between those events. So spring is, if you imagine, the highest, and neap is the highest range that the tide can go up the beach and go down the beach, and neap is the lowest range relatively, that the tide will go up the beach and down the beach. And then obviously we have all the other days and the tides in between that where the tide goes up and down. And dry height is the lowest it will go, and then charted depth, I'm assuming, is what they've measured, and the height of the tide is the total tide that it can go ish. So, but yeah, hope that makes sense. And it was right.
That's great, thank you. So I'll just add or just build on that, you know. So the kind of the way we measure tides in the UK is different to well, it's not so much the way we measure them, but it's the way we share that information in charts and you know, publications. Slightly different in the UK to other countries. So it's worth just, if you're doing stuff abroad or if you've paddled abroad a lot, just get used to these terminologies. So we talk about mean high water springs. That's the mean average high water height. And then, we've got this idea of the highest and lowest astronomical tide. So that's, being calculated as what's the least amount of water for lowest, chart datum. That's your 0 marks on the water on your charts, which we'll be covering next week. But that's, this idea of when, say in January now, when we've got our maximum, we're closest to the sun, we're getting the springiest springs, what's the measurement for the least amount of water and what's the measurement for the most amount of water. So that's, and the, the idea of ranges has been described to you well there. Thank you, Chris. So the difference between our mean high and our yeah. Oh, sorry, someone's going to come in there.
No,
Yeah.
I just covered.
Okay, no, cool, yeah, great. So I think the thing that's really interesting is this isn't just a once and done learn things. Does anyone know how much the sea level has risen in the last 100 years?
Is that
So
not
it's gone
a
up.
problem with calculating where 0.0 is?
Well, it's an interesting, yeah, I suppose there you go. But my understanding is that the sea level rise even out in the oceanic basins are seeing an average increase of 15 centimetres over the last 100 years. So that's quite a, you might not think that's a lot in over 4,500 metres of depth, but it's a significant shift, and it's likely to continue to change. And the other thing that's really interesting is a lot of our chart information and calculations, ultimately a lot of it comes from 18th century, 19th century. So it doesn't necessarily account for the changes that we're going through at the moment. We're going through a period of incredible change. So it's kind of both a super exciting time to be looking at this and an utterly terrifying one. So I think what I'm saying is, the tools that we're going to go through, you'll use them, but don't be surprised when you get big change. Things don't behave the way you would expect them to. One of the things that does anyone know? So the point you made about it depends on where it was measured. I'd maybe turn it into how it's or when it was measured. Maybe a when. Does anyone know the measuring? What pressure these measurements are based upon? What the average pressure is?
The atmospheric
so it's based upon
pressure.
Yeah, great. So what? Yeah, great. So which atmospheric pressure? What's the average that all these calculations are based on?
No, I'm out.
So it's
1,000.
So it's based on 10, yeah, close enough, 1013. So it's based on 1013 millibars. And that is, any millibar above or below it is a centimetre difference. So if you've got a big low coming in, as we do just now, I don't know, has anyone noticed just how low is that low? I can't look it up, but it's got to be quite something to be sending phone alerts.
936 in the Irish Sea.
936. Okay,
Yeah,
so
That's the
the difference
lowest,
between
lowest recorded.
unbelievable, right? So 936. So 1013 minus 936. There you go. That's your what's that? 64, 77. So that's a 77 centimeter difference, increase in the amount of water, because we've got this reduction. So consider that with now, any tidal action, you've got an extra 77 centimeters coming in. So that's phenomenal. So then with wind driving it, that's quite a change. So that's Does that make sense so far? Are we? And feel free if anyone's got different perspectives. Let's hear them. Feel free to push against anything that I'm saying. Okay, so we'll go forward on with this idea then of kind of rules first, as models. So, for those who are maybe starting out, there's a few kind of models that that are using the term rule. There's the rule of 12s, the rule of thirds. Who would like to tell us about the rule of 12s? Someone hasn't spoken before.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, maybe can you speak up a bit, or can you? Yeah, is your ball, Steve? That's that.
Sure. So this is about kind of measuring the change in the height of the tide over the period. So in the first hour after low water, the height will go by 1/12 of the height. So if you've got a 12-meter range, let's say on that day, the tide will rise by 1 meter. In the second hour, 2/12 rises by 2 meters. In the third hour, rises by 3 meters, and then 3, 2, 1, back to the start.
Great, thank you. Everyone agree with that? Anyone?
I thought it was to do with acceleration of the water.
Okay, so they're linked. They're absolutely linked. But this is the 12. So the 12s, if you're doing the 12s one, then you're talking about the height change. If you're using thirds, you're using that to, there's a debate about whether you should be using that or the 50-90 rule to get your rate of. Some say that the thirds is really a good way to work out how far you might have travelled using the speed and time, and that the rates are based on by the 50-90 rule. Does anyone want to kind of add in on that or tell us a bit more about their thoughts on it?
Surely, since water is a fluid object, the 50-90 rule is easier to use because it's a progression across the time. And also, if you were drawing it out on a graph as a bell curve, you can actually calculate it not necessarily at the points of the hours. You could do it at times between the hours. So if somebody said, what volume of water, what speed of water is going at 15 minutes to the hour? Because you're going to get some assessor who's going to ask you that.
Great. So, here's the same kind of rules from Gordon Brown here. And as you can see, he's actually taken account of the point that you're making there, which is when you start to actually, count, the first hour. So you can see I'll just flick between the two. You can see there's a slight difference there, particularly about how the 50-90 rule and when it starts. So it's whether you start it at the, if you're starting in the middle of the hour, which is how you do your yacht master, you're encouraged to actually start, you do your first 30 minutes and then you count from there. So it's about being in the middle. So, yeah, okay. And then the bell curve, this here is open, which is, a fairly standardish kind of bell curve. Not all tidal ports have this relative uniformity. But you can see here that, the thing about a bell curve is it tends to have the greatest acceleration in that section between, where the curve is greatest, and you can see between -4 and -2 there, whereas say -6 to -4.5, it's not, the acceleration isn't as much. and the acceleration is decreased towards the top of the curve. So that's a way to kind of understand what we're looking at when we use these ideas of the thirds 50-90. Okay. Before I move on, does anyone want to dive deeper into any of that stuff just now, or any personal experiences that differ from it, or different models that people would like to suggest? Okay, so we'll have a quick jaunt through some resources. Some of you will, yeah, and again, I'd love to hear if people are using different ones. I'm going to share links to all this stuff at the end, or like I said in the email. So typically you're going to have things like CCAT guides. Pez the Press do a brilliant selection of them. We're going to look at that. Many of you will use the almanac, the Reed's almanac. There's the pilot, the sailing directions, and lovely. You get a choice there as to which one do you like to use, and we'll look at that as well. And then, of course, these days there's pretty much there's an app for everything. So it'll be interesting to know what apps you use and how reliable you find them to be. So, this here is, for those who are not familiar with it, it's the Pez the Press. They do a series of guides, which are absolutely brilliant. They have a sort of narrativized account of what a standard journey might be like for different parts of Scotland or different parts of the UK. And they present, tidal information like this here, which is you can see high water, local high water is 2 hours, 50 minutes. 2 hours, 5 minutes before high water Lerwick, and then the map tells us what the maximum rate at spring is. And then quite often they will give us a handy diagram with you can see the arrows at the bottom here in the kind of southeast and the northwest corners of this. So when it's going, and these are significant tides. Now, if you were going to, Papa Stour, and you're going to do this journey, would you rely on that? Is this enough information, do you think? Any thoughts? Anyone?
No, you would need to think about, you need to think about other sources of information, whether it's a sailing almanac as well as the Pez the Press books, but they are an amalgamation or some melting down of other sources. But I know of one of the Pez the Press books which is renownedly inaccurate, and so having multiple sources of information, you can say, yeah, there's a consensus from all, say, 3 or 4 types, whether it's the Clyde sailing books or the Pez the Press or the pilot.
Brilliant. Excellent. I couldn't agree more. That was perfectly put. So yeah, if you're going to go somewhere where it's potentially consequential, then absolutely, double check, triple check, and we'll have a wee look at that in a second. And I've had experience. The Pez Press books are great, and the later editions are correcting maybe some errors that creeped into the maybe early editions. But like you say, I've been caught out with back in the past. That was a good lesson. I'd relied on one of these diagrams, and it was significantly different. So, other sources. So this here is the Small Craft Almanac. So it's aimed to sailors. Comes out every year. It can be a good source of tides, and it also has for good information about ports, harbours, and there is some information around tidal streams as well. For those who are familiar with it, can anyone tell us anything about the shadings that they see here?
Yeah, summertime in GMT.
Great. So you would have to make a calc. You know, you can't just take these numbers, these and just go, okay, that time works for me. You've got to check, you know, are we in GMT or are we in daylight saving time, and then you need to work out whether to add an hour or not. And I'm sure many a paddler has been caught out by that. The interesting thing as well is you can look at these and go, okay, which ones are, it's not very clear in this photo I've taken, but it does say that the springs are in a slightly more bold kind of colour. So that can be helpful. You can, but as you can see, you can quite easily miss that. How many of you use this? How many of you use in fact, who can tell us what this is and how they use it? Does anyone use it? I love this, I have to say. This is one of my favourites. So this here is the coefficients, and if you look down at the bottom, what it does is it gives you this here. The ones are mean spring tide. So mean spring tide is, remember when we had that diagram and we talked about mean high water, mean low water. Right. So there we are. Mean spring tide got a coefficient number of 95, and mean neap tide's got a coefficient of 45. And then, so because we know that we've got this crazy elliptical journey as we spin through space and the water slops around us, and we try to work out what that actually means for for our paddling. This here can be a really great way to take a snapshot at the start of the year. So if you were, say for instance, you wanted to go to, let's say, the Bell Rock. So the Bell Rock's on the east coast. It's normally covered, by water. So what you really want is a particularly low tide. You've got to paddle 20k to get there. You want to be able to get out your boat, have a look at Stevenson Lighthouse. So you want to be really have a fair bit of confidence that you're going to have a nice low tide. So, if rather than pour through pages of different tides times, trying to work out different ranges, you can just go, okay, well, where's the big numbers here, and then you can go, right, which dates have got big numbers. So I'm seeing here that there's around about, say, September, October the 8th, you've got 97, 101, and then in October 109, 110. So you've got there's a couple of points that are jumping out straight away, and I'm going, okay, maybe that's a target time for doing this. And I would take a note of all the ones where are target ones, and then I would go to have a look at what's the timings for those dates, so when will I need to set off, and then I'd maybe be thinking about what's the weather, how much light am I going to have, and what's the typical weather at that time of year. So it's a way to do forward planning for some of those bigger, more exciting trips. Imagine you wanted to, I don't know, go for a potter through the Corrie Vrecken, so somewhere that is consequential, and you wanted to, it was on your to-do list for the year, and you didn't want an epic, you wanted it to be an enjoyable experience. So what would you do? Well, I'd suggest what you do is you look for a really low coefficient number, and you see the days where they are, and then you again go off and do the research to see, okay, now for those days, when actually is the tides, how does that affect the rest of my tidal planning and journey to get through and get out of, the Corrie Vrecken. So this gives a good high level. It's this weird kind of non-metric kind of scale, and it takes a wee bit to kind of seep into the brain. But once it does, it's I look for it everywhere, and I'm really disappointed when I don't find it in a tidal planning resource or tool. So apps, here's an app that I use, which is the IMRI Tidal Planner. And one of the things I love about it is that it has the coefficients. So that's the wee numbers that we've got at the in parentheses here. So you can see that today, so this is today, we've got in parentheses it says 32. So can anyone remember what that is? Is that like a standard neap, a big neap?
That's a small neap.
Yeah, it's a small neap. So, a very small would be around, 24-ish, 20-ish, that's really super. But like the average is 45. So we're sitting between the two, so it's actually quite a small neap. And that's a real blessing for today, for this storm, considering that, we've got such a low out there, and we know that in relation, we've got an extra 70 odd centimetres of water, but just from atmospheric pressure in the Irish Sea. So thank goodness that it's such a small neap. Can you imagine what it'd be like if we were at the other end of things, if we were up at 110 for the coefficient? The destruction would be really, really, really scary. Does that make sense? Yeah. So if you're I'd be interested to know what apps you use. I love the IMRI app because it has coefficients in it, and I love it because it also shows. Now this here is a screen grab of the tidal stream atlas, and for those who are not familiar with it, this is a kind of idealized vector demonstration of how the tides move around our coast. It's the same thing that's been put into, to some extent, into the Windy app I showed earlier, but they do it in the IMRI app. They very literally take the information from the tidal stream atlas and they put it into the app, and you can just set the date that you want to look at it for, and then you can plus hour, minus hour, and you can toggle so you can see what the tidal stream forecast is according to the Admiralty from this app, which is tremendously useful to not have to then sit with tables and work out which page should I be looking at from my paper atlas, to just be able to kind of semi-auto toggle it. Does anyone use a different app for that has similar functionality? What do you use?
It definitely doesn't have as much functionality as that. It's an app. It's very simple. It's called Tide Times. So you can set it. I don't know how well everyone's going to see that on a screen, but you can set it to like local locations and things like that. So let's go for bowling, for example. It will give you like highs, lows. You can change your days. It's got moon cycles as well, and it's also got some more information about like what the wind strength is going to be, where it's going to be coming from, that kind of stuff as well. So it gives you your highs, your lows, sunrise, sunset, and what the height of the tide is going to be when it's the high tide and low tide, which I find quite useful. But
great. I mean, that sounds brilliant. Does anyone use a different one? Anyone got a favourite as well that's different?
Yeah, I use Tides Near Me, and in conjunction with Tides. So Tides Near Me gives me the high and low tide times on the ports that you're working from. And then the Tides app, which is a different app again, that gives me the range and the size of the tides. So you can see the pattern of when it's building up springs, and it gives you the range of the tides. So I use the two together.
Brilliant.
So I can see whether it's coming up to springs or not. It's probably not going to show up on the, but can you see the pattern there?
Yeah, that looks good. Can I maybe encourage people to, for those of you who are just showing your apps, or if you've got a favourite app, can you type it into the chat? And then what we can do is we can share these ideas around. And if you if you use a different app and you just prefer not to talked to everyone about it just now, that's fine. But you know, like, do share what you use. You know, because ultimately it's about finding something that you like to use and that works for how you like to process information. We're all different. So if we all share, what we'll do is we pull all this information together, we'll share it in the sheet that follows on from this in the email, and then hopefully we can inspire each other with our own ideas. So here we've got the west coast of Scotland from the Tidal Stream Atlas, and you can see the general direction of this is showing the direction of flood, and you can see it's quite interesting. It does, like, it's coming in from from the west, from the southwest, but then it does things like it heads down. It turns and goes down into the Irish Sea there, and of course what it does in the west coast and amongst all our islands is very complicated. So let's have a look here at this here is taken from Memory Map. So Memory Maps are a useful app to where you can see and print from it's basically the Admiralty maps, or sorry, charts I should say, in digital form. And let's have a look here at Cuan Sound. So if you can see that right it's kind of in the middle there between Line and Seal. So could someone tell us who's not familiar with the area, or not, who doesn't paddle there regularly, but which direction would you think, based upon the information, if all you're going is the information we're going through this evening, which direction do you think it floods into Cuan Sound? Any answer is a good answer from someone. Fire in. Okay, well, I'll just tell the interesting thing is you would expect it, the Cuan Sound, you'd expect it to flood maybe like it did into the Irish Sea, round from the north and pushing down, but it's the other way. It's actually flooding up, so it's north going. It's a north going flood. So that's kind of counterintuitive. It's not what you would expect. So it's and it's a consequential kind of environment because it's running at quite a few knots, and the information is, I'll put off to the left here, the tidal diamonds, and when you look here, you can actually you're like, wait a minute, where is the tidal diamonds? Well, there's none actually in close. There's 1G, but it's out a wee bit, and you're like, that's is that close enough to actually be telling me what I want? It's probably not, So where do you get your information from? So, you can, here's the same kind of presentation, as it were, this is from the Navionics app. Navionics is one of the things I really like about Navionics is that it shows here the bathymetry. It shows here the seafloor, and it's a crowdsourced depiction of it. So what it does is, if you're a sailor and you have sounding or depth equipment on, depth sounder on your yacht, and it uses Garmin technology, then it crowdsources that data, and that feeds into Navionics. So this is really interesting because it means that we're not dependent on just having, say, lead soundings from the 18th century, which actually a lot of Admiralty charts are based on. And you can see here the complexity of the bathymetry here in the Cuan Sound. So you're like, yeah, what's that going to do? What's that going to be like? So where do I get this information from? So I'm showing here two different sources And someone earlier on mentioned, back when we first looked at the ESTA guides, and they said, well, why don't, I'd look at multiple sources, I'd maybe look at multiple pilots. And so what we've got on this kind of top right corner is a copied in here from the Admiralty pilot. So I would have a look at that there, and what it says is, that the north going stream begins at plus 420, and it says that it's running at 4 knots. Okay, so that's based upon high water Oban, north going stream 0420. Now below that, I've tried to blow it up, but it's hasn't blown up very well. So if you can't read it, I'll read it out to you. And it's basically the same thing that's on the left, and that's taken from the Clyde cruising sailing directions. And what it says is that the flood tide runs westwards, beginning at plus 430, so pretty close. Okay, only 10-minute difference. Oban at Springs, and then it says but it's at zero. At plus 0515 Oban at Neeps. So that's a 45-minute difference that the Clyde, cruising is telling us if it's the difference between Neeps and Springs. And remember, that's going to be then based upon average Springs and average Neeps, and we know that we're below, we're at superish Neeps at the moment, and we could have super Springs, So, you could, and we'll get a 45-minute difference there from them. So you're now in this situation where you go, okay, which of these do I believe? Let's just say you're doing a neat paddle through Coon. Are you going to base your paddling on Clyde cruising, or are you going to base it on Admiralty? And then how are you going to factor in the difference from atmospheric pressure, weather, So, any thoughts about, does anyone want to kind of add in just now? Anything on that?
You mentioned also spidey sensors.
Great.
You
Great. So I think
what's
that's
going on with your boat.
brilliant. So that's where we're going with it, which is, proceed cautiously and develop your feel for it. So all this information here is amazing. And you should absolutely, investigate and, do the maths and, run your models and run multiple models, and then, but, don't, the first time you turn up at Coon, don't go like, rushing into a, major flow or, don't, you probably wouldn't do that anyway, but, I would say just stop and listen, look around. The other thing you can do is speak to locals, speak to people who have done it a lot, ask them which model they use, why, see if it varies, and then develop your own spidey sense, develop your own feel, and listen to your intuition. So build up your own knowledge base, your own judgment. It's really, really key, and speak to others who have judgment, whose judgment you respect, The Sound of Harris is really famous for, having tides that do, just they're really hard to make sense of, to the point that if you look up the Admiralty, sailing directions for there, it just says speak to a local. It literally says in there speak to a local. And if you ask the locals who to speak to, they send you to Leverborough. There's a thing called the Butty Van, and the guy who runs it used to be coxswain of the lifeboat. And then if you go and ask that person, depending on what mood they're in and what the weather's doing, they'll either give you information that he feels comfortable with, or they'll just kind of shrug their shoulders and go, kind of looking at it outside. Because the reality is, even with all that, all that experience, that hundreds of thousands of hours that that person has, experience, they will know that it will still confine, it still has the capacity to confound them. So, okay, so that brings us to our spidey senses. How do we develop spidey senses, and how, where else can we turn kind of for that? Does anyone here speak Gaelic? I was really hoping we'd have a Gaelic speaker, because I don't, and I'm now really, I'm thinking it's worth learning, just because place names, Gaelic was a language when Scotland was a seafaring nation, so it's our place names have a lot of really useful information.
But the place names that are useful, not Norse, like Tarbert.
Great, Tarbert's a brilliant example. So yeah, that's do you want to tell us about that, Tarbert? What typically
It's where you can pull out across a small stretch of land to save you going around the long peninsula.
Fabulous, great. So that key information for if you're a Viking, or who knows, the way we're going, we might, those knowledge of those portage points might become useful again. Struth, I've learned from, there's a very good paddler operating out at the Scaladale Centre in Harris, called Tom Thorpe, and he comes from Cornwall, and he's been hunting for struths on the kind of Gaelic place names, because it means stream, and he's finding that there's a correlation between struth and exciting tidal play spots, which aren't in any guide. They aren't in any, they're not necessarily marked in any chart, so he's finding playgrounds to explore based on struth, Cal, does anyone know what Cal or cowl means? See, I was really hoping there was someone here so I could check this, my knowledge on it. So my understanding is it's effectively like a kind of bay. I might be wrong. So have a look at the names, and on your OS maps, or and look for the Gaelic names, see which ones are popping up and what the features are there. Ruva, anyone?
Oh, I thought cool meant narrows, but anyway, not Tory.
Bent Narrows, is it Bent Narrows? So yeah, okay, well, great. Well, that's great. I will bow to that. I think that would make sense, actually.
I was going to say, yeah, Cowls are narrowing, but also like the name Ballachulish means town by the Narrows, though. So Hoolish, I think, is Narrows too.
Great. So brilliant, great sharing. So there we go. So if we've got Narrows, what's going to happen in the Narrows? We're going to have a tidal acceleration, aren't we, because of water trying to squeeze through. So if you see Cal, or you see, what was it, Hool, was it? Yeah, in the name.
Yeah, and it also translates to Kyle.
Kyle, brilliant. So there we go.
I think.
I was going to mention Kyle. Kyle's a butte. Kyle's of Lochalsh. So it's narrow.
So that makes sense. You could see then the kind of anglicisation of that term, Kyle becoming Kyle. Brilliant. So, if you were paddling through an area where there wasn't a lot of tidal information, because it is, and it had the name Kyle in it, you might want to be like, yeah, spidey senses, let's check with the locals, let's find out a wee bit, or maybe let's watch and see for a bit, what's my get out? Is there a tidal gate? Is there a point of no return? Really study that. Ruva, anyone know Ruva?
Headland.
My understanding, again, I might be wrong, is it's like a reef area. It's not just so it's an area from deeper water coming into rock-based shallows. So
I'd go with headland or point.
You'd go with headland or point, would you? Yeah.
So you might very well have rocky, kind of rocky ground, that projects out into the sea, most definitely. But
Great.
I think the Headlander point.
Yeah, if you think of
Brilliant.
things like Rua Ray, it's a big, it's the headland. Like look at the places on Skye where it's headland.
Great. So like Riverhoonish and stuff like that. Great.
Yeah.
Points. So again, what's a point going to do pushing out into the flow? Is it going to accelerate or decelerate the flow?
Yeah. They're all mystical names.
Say that again, sorry. The what?
I said they're all mystical names.
Oh, mystical names. Yeah, good.
Yeah, just they offer it intrigue and and adventure.
Well, that's why we're here, isn't it? Intrigue and the adventure on the sea, isn't it? We're all paddling our own journeys of adventure. Any other? So those are three that it's been great to learn from yourselves here. Is there any other names that people look out for or are aware of that they'd want to share?
Ferry. If there's a ferry, there's a tidal rip. Because that's how the Scots powered the ferries in the Middle Ages. So all up the east coast, from north, from Inverness, it's ferry, 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 ferry. They've all got tidal rips in them.
That's brilliant. I didn't know that. That's great. That's one to look out for. Awesome.
Another one which is quite useful is port, P-O-R-T, just like in English, which generally means somewhere where you can get in and out.
Yes.
Great. Good. Any final ones, folks? Okay. Any other kind of spidey sense things that people would want to, share or suggest?
I don't get spidey, sorry.
Yeah, I suppose it's just the kind of like, okay, well, I mean, ultimately it's like, what do you, let's move closer to, we're by using names, they're quite definite, aren't we? So, but what would you want to do from a kind of more sense-based, I want to move away, I suppose the point is to not just rely on data that is, from a model. Where when you move to a name, you start to move it to maybe more subjective, but there's perhaps, experience information in there. And then if you go further into just more subjective experience, then you get into more sense-based approach. So what would you, is how can you build up that kind of experience base or that sense-based approach, not just one where you're relying on models from books or apps.
I suppose if you're paddling in a place you know relatively well on a regular basis, you could take a note of what the tides are meant to be doing on that particular day when you go out. You go out and you observe and you go, yeah, actually that felt right. And then you come back and you go, actually, no, that was complete load of codswallop. But there could be an underlying factor, and it might be a higher or low pressure pushing in that's just making things move around in a different manner, or it might be fronts moving in with the weather. And so your baseline knowledge of what could be there is then augmented by reality. So then you start building up your feeling about what's happening on the water a little bit more by saying, well, I'm here on a nice flat calm weather day. There's no wind, there's no rain. I can see for miles and everything just is moving around really nicely, and I can understand what might happen as I go around a headland or through a gap. Or I go out on a day when it's a little bit more challenging, and then you find that actually, that gap doesn't quite work today because it's surging too much or something like that. So you're building up that experience from really just time on the water and hopefully not in the water.
Brilliant. So that's a really nice, it's kind of like a logbook approach, but quite some detail in it, and then comparing, you put your experience in, and then you are contrasting that with maybe what the forecast was and what the tidal predictions were, and then you're building up this kind of, I suppose, a combination of science where you are recording your experience and putting it against predictions, and then you're developing that into a sense of, okay, if when you've got exceptions, that you're starting to recognise them and you're understanding what are causing those patterns.
Yeah.
Great. So sense and science together.
Yeah, I use I look at buoys. If there's an eddy on the back, you know the tide's starting to run, or seagrass direction. If it's clear, you see the seagrass slope and leaning one way, and even just seeing the movement on the water. If you've got white horses out, you're wondering, and the wind is against the tide, you know that the tide is probably starting to run.
Brilliant. That's great. So take signals, indicators from your natural environment, and using them to inform what's happening. Awesome. I love the idea of looking at the seagrass.
Yeah.
Nice. So I'll just a couple more slides. On one here is so this shows the effect of current, the combined effect of swell from long and short period swell against current, and that's one of these things where it's not always apparent. It has to, you might, unless you have really accurately worked out what the what the swell forecast is going to be, what the current's going to be, and you understand how that's going to affect the particular environment that you're in. The odds are you're going to have to build that up experientially. So that kind of science and sense-based approach, of the logbook is really useful. So if you're, you might, there's three very different styles of, wave pattern, the wave pattern in the middle there as to how you might experience that. And it might take a while to really build up, the understanding of which you're in, which you're enjoying, which are fun to paddle in, which develop your paddling, and which you really want to stay away from. So again, that's science and sense-based approach. Although this year is taken from website UK SEACAT Guidebook. So Mike Buckley built this together, and it's the kind of, you've probably seen versions of this in some of the Gordon Brown books, which are excellent, and Press 2. And it's the bit in the middle is particularly interesting, this idea of sort of tidal retardation. So, which is basically like, if you're finding it hard going and you're moving, you're not getting there at the rate that your exertion feels, then perhaps this is what's going on, and he's put it into a quite a science-based approach. So again, this is one for you. This is to work out. I think this is a model, and the thing to do would be to adapt it using that science and sense-based approach of the logbook to work out what different flows, different wind speeds you're working against, how that affects actually your pace, and then from that you'll start to develop a sense of whether the tide has turned earlier. Was that 45 minutes difference at Kuhn? Which one is correct? Yeah. Okay. Does anyone want to add in any thoughts on this here? Does anyone use a different kind of way to measure or record the difference between their expected journey rate and what they're achieving? Okay, I'll stop sharing screen in a wee second. A lot of these images are from 3 different books. Apart from the Pesta presses, we've gone through and I've shown the almanacs and the Reed's Almanac and the Pesta ones and the Admiralty and the Clyde cruising ones, and we'll put all these in the list that we sell around. But there's 3 books here that I think I found particularly useful, and I'd love to know any resources that you find useful. Again, please put it into the chat so that we can all share and learn from each other. And for me, these ones are great. Waves and Beaches. It's an updated version of this kind of Bible written by Bascom, Willard Bascom, that's been brought up to date. Really helpful for the big picture and particularly the impact of the changes that we're going through at the moment and how that might actually affect tidal behaviours in ways that we've yet to even predict. Coastal Turmoil is a superb book that really looks at the kind of coastal environment in which we as paddlers tend to operate. And it really looks at things like the interplay between not only tides but with wind and wind shadows and swell together. So you've got these 3 different, mixed in with the bathymetry and things like headlands, headlands and narrows, And then the Mastering Navigation at Sea from Fernhurst books. I think are really, really, really excellent too. But what do you use? What's giving you inspiration? Please share in the chat. I'd love to get your feedback. I think you're going to be sent around an evaluation form. So I love your thoughts on what's resonated about this and what hasn't. This is the first of these that I've given for Paddle Scotland. So apologies for anything. Apologies if I haven't hit the mark, but by giving me feedback, you can help me learn and improve and refine for future. I think we're going to stay on for a wee bit, but I'll just stop sharing screen so that we can have maybe more of a kind of open discussion.